Good evening, everyone.
Oh, come on now, really? We've been locked up in our houses, ain't been in a room with nobody. She says good evening, y'all like,
Well, I hope you are as excited as I am to speak to Professor Jelani Cobb. You are somebody that I have a huge amount of admiration and respect for. I love when you are on CNN and MSNBC and all the other places where you come into our living rooms and provide us with an amazing perspective on African American life. And so thank you for providing context and taking the contemporary, matching it with historical, and providing us with ways in which to think more deeply about what's happening today. And that is exactly what you do in the essential Kerner Commission report. So thank you so much for putting it together and giving us an opportunity, myself an opportunity, to talk a little bit about this. As I was reading the pages, I thought to myself, wow, this book is the reason why I do a lot of the work that I do, why it's positioned in the way that I am. And so I just wanted to thank you for putting it together and giving us all an opportunity to dig a little bit more deeply into why you decided to write this book and how it really connects to things like intersectionality, critical race theory, and all the things that we're talking about right now. So with that said, I want to start at the very beginning. It is the essential Kerner report, and so I think it's important that it is essential, particularly at this time where we're talking about essential workers. And I just wanted to ask you, what made you think that it was important for us to be able to look back at that commission in order to be able to make sense of our current times?
So first off, I want to say thank you to the Center for Fiction and to you for making time to talk about this book tonight. It's a very important project. I worked on it with Matthew, who's a former graduate student of mine, actually. And we, in the summer of 2020, when all sorts of things were going on, we were sitting around trying to figure out how to extract from the Kerner Commission, the very key things that people needed to know that might help contextualize the world we were in at that moment. And even the way that we were doing the work was strange because I teach at Columbia and we were not allowed to go to campus. Our offices were off limits. And I also have, at the time that lockdown happened, had a 2-year-old daughter and 5-month-old twins.
Oh, wow.
Right. And there was all this work coming in that people wanted me to do. And I kept going, how? Like, how? How do you expect any of this to get done?
Right.
And then in a kind of moment of desperation / inspiration, it occurred to me that there had to be all of these empty Airbnbs because nobody was traveling. And so I just found an Airbnb in Harlem and turned it into my office. I would go there in the morning, work 9 to 5, ride my bike home, and that was how we worked on this. And Matthew was in San Francisco.
Oh, wow.
And so we would just get on the phone, we'd get on Zoom, and we'd kind of walk through, what the Kerner report was saying. And really, it was kind of therapeutic as we were dealing with the disorientation, of the summer of 2020 and, the trauma of seeing that video of George Floyd's death. So I'm sorry if I wanted to feel, but that was kind of how this came about when we were both, familiar with the Kerner report and what it said and how its warnings had gone unheeded. And now we were yet again seeing a moment where it was relevant to current events.
Thank you for that. For those of you who either don't know or need to be reminded, the Kerner report was released 1 month before the Martin Luther King died and before the riots that happened at that time. So tell us a little bit about the context that brought the Kerner report to be commissioned.
So in order to get to the context, first off, I'm a historian. So if you tell us the context,
we could be here a while.
We'll start, in biblical times, and work our way forward. But really, when we look at the history of the 20th century, and the particular history of kind of racial unrest and the very antiseptic, bureaucratic language they call civil disturbances. The 20th century is dotted with them, and they overwhelmingly relate to incidents of police violence. In 1935, there's a 15-year-old Puerto Rican kid who is beaten by police. He's accused of shoplifting in a store. The police beat him in front of other shoppers, customers. Word gets out what is happening, and a full-scale riot, or uprising breaks out in Harlem. In 1943, the police beat a black soldier in uniform who's home on leave. Another riot breaks out in Harlem. That's famously discussed, memorialized really in James Baldwin's writings. He talks about that contextually. Same thing in 1943 in Detroit. A similar incident happens, but it's not police involvement. We go through just series of this. 1965 in Watts, of course. 66 in Cincinnati. 67 in Detroit and Newark. And those are just the major incidents. There are 24 of them that they talk about in this book. And they consistently come back to police and policing. And so 1965 is really important because the Voting Rights Act is signed. Lyndon B. Johnson has secured what he thinks is his legacy as the most forward-thinking president on civil rights, having in successive years signed the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and what comes to be known as the War on Poverty programs are coalescing, at this time. But 5 days after he signs the Voting Rights Act, Watts explodes.
Right.
And people have this sense that the reforms are trying to keep pace with the anger. And the anger is outpacing the reforms. And so in 1966, there's more. In 1967, there are the cataclysmic eruptions that take place in Newark and Detroit, which are about 10 days apart. The National Guard is called out in all of these incidents. And Lyndon Johnson summons a group of 11 people, 9 of whom are white, 10 of whom are male, Democrats and Republicans, local office holders and labor union officials and so on, up to senators and the governor of Illinois, Otto Kerner, who the commission is named after. And he gives them a charge. He says, I want you to find out what happened, find out why it happened, and find out what can be done to prevent it from happening again. And with that, they set about their work. And we now have this idea, we generally have this idea when someone says they're going to appoint a commission, it means they really don't want to do anything, or that they want a rubber stamp.
Right.
But as talented and skillful a politician as Lyndon Johnson was, this commission got out from under him. Its findings and its expansive, condemnatory indictment of American racism is just stunning. It's stunning to read now. I doubt that a report like this would be published, in 2021. And this is what came out, of the Kerner Commission report.
That's fantastic. And you did do a really good job of taking us through, what was that, 30 or 40 years of history and of policing in America in a very short period of time. You touched upon what happened in Detroit and what happened in Newark, and that really, to me, was one of the largest backdrops for this report. Can you talk a little bit more explicitly about what happened in those two cities?
Sure. In Newark, a cab driver by the name of John Smith was pulled over by police, and in the course of this traffic stop, the police began beating him. And passers-by see that they're not even taking him back to the station house. They're not taking him to an alley somewhere. They're laying it on this man right there in full view of the public. And that's the igniting incident, that people talk about. They begin throwing trash, they begin throwing bottles. And from there, people begin smashing, windows. the poet Amiri Baraka is, in the course of, it's 5 days that this goes on. In the course of it, he's pulled over while driving and beaten by police so badly, beaten nearly to death, for no reason. He said there's no, other than he's Amiri Baraka. And he's charged with participating in the riot. Famously, the judge reads one of his poems at his trial. If there's any kind of question about freedom of speech, or the poem "Black People," which has the famous line, some of you who know his work, people, if you don't know that poem, the kind of line in there where he says that all the doors will open if you know the magic words. The magic words are "up against the wall, motherfucker, this is a stick up," or "smash the window at night, these are magic actions." And so they said that he's, by the force of his poetry, responsible for the bedlam that has taken over the city of Newark. But more realistically, what's happened in Newark, and what's happened in Detroit, and what's happened in a lot of these cities, is that they are already suffering from the kinds of problems that people think of as endemic to American cities in the 1970s. We have given a false and exculpatory version of American history in which these riots happen and then white people leave the cities.
Right.
You know full well that's not what happens. World War II happens, and with the end of World War II, this vast acceleration of the American housing market and the creation of suburbia, all of which is calibrated to the benefit of white people. And so if you look at Newark between 1940 and 1950, the white population declines then.
Right.
And then if you look again between 1950 and 1960, the population declines even further between 1960 and 1970. But by the time you get to like the middle of the 1960s, you're looking at 2 decades of erosion of the tax base. Black people are making less money. They are trapped in menial jobs. Cities are now relying upon their worst paid residents for the tax base for their municipal services. And with the commission, when they go out, like one of the reasons, I had the opportunity to interview Fred Harris, who is the last remaining member of the commission. He's 90 years old, former US Senator from Oklahoma. And he said the thing that really sent this commission, which was as middle of the road as you could get, these were moderate people generally. He said what sent them down the road to the radical conclusions that they drew was when they went on these fact-finding missions and they went to these cities where these incidents took place. And he personally talked about being stunned when he went to Cincinnati and saw that the city didn't have enough money to pick up the garbage. And that there were human beings living in communities that were surrounded by garbage and everything that garbage breeds, disease, rats, et cetera, in America in the 20th century. And so he simply said there's no way we would allow people to live like this if they were white. And that the reason that people are living like this is the fact that they're black. And that is kind of the backdrop to Newark. Like all of these things are happening up until the moment that the officer swings the billy club at John Smith's head for the first time. And that simply ignites kindling that had been there all along. We could talk about that in Detroit. We could talk about that in Cincinnati. We could talk about it in many of these cities with the similar dynamics that lead to this happening. And of course, Detroit is, there's, those of you who may have seen the film, the Catherine Bigelow film, which depicts the moment, the after hours joint that the police raid and cart everyone out, and the handling of people who were, drinking and partying in this after hours spot sparks the same sort of reaction that people in Newark had when they saw John Smith being beaten.
You mentioned that usually when people have a commission, it's because they want to have something done and leave it there, but not actually do any of the actions. But that Lyndon Baines Johnson was probably pretty surprised at what came out of this report. I wanted to share with you all a quote that is in the book that's from the report that really stood out to me, that I think stands out to a lot of folks. And in it, it says that what white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. This is page 2.
Yeah.
This is not the final page.
No.
This is page 2.
And so in talking with Fred Harris about this was really fascinating because he said there were 11 people and they went through this series of 6 to 5 votes that almost like a tree diagram, where they'd say, is there something to blame for this besides racism? No, it's pretty much racism. And do we think it's policing? No, it's all of the systems that are working in concert institutionally. Do we think this is unintentional? No, this is intentional. And they keep going further and further down this road. And at the end of it, they realize where they are, and they go back, and even the people who are dissenters have to concede this is pretty much what we have found. And so they haggled over that language, but ultimately said that they needed to say that up front, that we have to say very clearly how we understand this problem and where we think it came from. And so that's where they start with. And there's a colorful story that Fred Harris tells. I think he's 91 now, and I spent 2 days with him in Albuquerque, where he's retired. And I think once a politician, always a politician, because you sit down, he starts telling stories and cracking jokes, and you realize 2 hours have gone by. Like he just is a person who knows how to interact with people.
Right.
And he said, I wrangled an endorsement when I was running for the Senate. I wrangled an endorsement out of Lyndon Baines Johnson. And what I did was I just had people show up with cameras while I was standing next to him. There was supposed to be no cameras at this event. And he said, but he said, Johnson had this gift. You put a camera on him, he just said the thing that he needed to say. And he said, President Johnson, will you endorse Fred Harris for the Senate? And he said, I'm going to tell. He said, first he looked at these people, shot them a death stare, why is this camera here? There's supposed to be no press. He said he then turned back to the camera and smiled and said, I'm going to tell the good people of Oklahoma to vote for Fred Harris, and together we will storm hell with a bucket of water. And I said, that's like a great endorsement. But he said that Johnson also told him, when he put him on the commission, he said, you're a Johnson man. If you forget that, I'll come over there and cut your blank off. Just something LBJ would have said, There's a whole catalog of LBJ-isms, If you can permit me one diversion, my favorite of which is, it's just the poetic economy of this. The line, we said, what's the difference between a caucus and a cactus? He said, with a cactus, the pricks are on the outside. Which, CC Joe Manchin. In any case, they were very clear that they were going against what Johnson expected. Johnson really wanted this commission to say that the problem was communists. The communists were stirring up trouble in American cities, and none of this was really homegrown. And they exhaustively, that was one of the things on the tree diagram, do we think there's any evidence of communism being involved? No. What do we think is involved? White racism. And it starts there.
Wow, I did not realize that. I did not realize about the tree, but I do think that one of the things that struck me in reading the book and reading the commission was that the book really introduces some ideas that are contemporary now.
Yes.
So one of the things was about intersectionality. And so it wasn't, the report was to ask about, like you said, what happened, how can we prevent it from happening again, but really started to talk about housing and education, underemployment, employment. So talk to us a little bit about that intersectionality that's introduced through the commission.
So one of the things that they dispense with, early on, is the idea that you just need to reform police. And they said, look, no, this is about housing, this is about education, this is about healthcare, this is about media, this is about employment and unemployment, all of the institutions that really relate to life outcomes. And when they kind of walked through the data of the systemic differentiation between how those institutions interacted with black people and how they interacted with white people, or how they interacted with non-white people. They just came to this holistic understanding, of the problem. And they were saying, well, you can't really talk about policing without also talking about unemployment. And you can't talk about unemployment without talking about education.
Right.
You can't talk about education without talking about housing. And they found this kind of, Venn overlap of all of these things that were creating what they called then, in the language that they would have used then, the ghetto. And one of the things I'll say about this is that black sociologists had been talking about this forever. W.B. Du Bois and the Philadelphia Negro, which was 1899, is talking about this. Sinclair Drake and Horace Caton in Black Metropolis, which I think comes out in the 1940s, they talk about this. E. Franklin Frazier, like the whole array of black scholars had been pointing to this over time. Even American Dilemma, which was the famous 2-volume examination of race in the United States that came out after World War II, in the first couple of years after its release, after the end of the war rather, and they talked about the kind of interconnected ways of racism functioning in the lives of black people, and went so far as to say that there was no Negro problem in America, that there was a white problem in America. Everybody knew that, but it was very different to have a committee composed of 9 of 11 white people with the ear of the president looking at American cities and going, yeah, we did this. Right. And I think that's one of the reasons why the report has stayed so relevant to current events.
And I think it's important for the audience to know what the reaction to in the general public was to the release of the report versus Lyndon Johnson's response to the report.
So Lyndon Johnson didn't respond to the report. He created the commission. He ignored its findings. He refused to meet with the commission because, he's the president. He knew what was in the report before the report was done. He had people in the commission who were reporting back to him. And he just pretended that it never happened. And Fred Harris, along with, interestingly enough, his main co-conspirator in this was John Lindsay, the former mayor of New York City. And so Harris and Lindsay had an idea that in addition to producing this government report for the White House, that it also needed to be published on a commercial press. And the report comes out, the White House ignores it. A few weeks later, it comes out in print and rockets up the New York Times bestseller list. This is all before Martin Luther King has died. And so and it was also unprecedented for there to be a government report that was a New York Times bestseller. And so when you look at it, people are really trying to understand what's happening in the same way that people were trying to understand George Floyd and Breonna Taylor last year, to try to understand what the interconnected nature of those situations was. And then Martin Luther King is killed. And the book explodes even more, as 100 American cities go up in flames. More than 100 American cities go up in flames. And it was that fateful decision to publish it as a book that ensured that it wouldn't just be more dead paper, bureaucratic pile in a obscure library somewhere.
And yet, even though so many people read about it, and were able to, and the report, I'm telling you, if you have not read it, it is literally riveting because it's just so detailed. It's talks about the woman who sends her son out to pick up the garbage and ends up getting shot by, National Guardsmen, right? So that's part of the race riot, an 11-year-old kid taking out the garbage, right? And so, the public is reading this, and yet in the end, what the response is law and order.
Right.
Yeah, so how did that happen?
So it's interesting, because this report, and to a certain extent, Lyndon B. Johnson was right. And Fred Harris said that so much when I talked to him. Johnson's political instincts were not faulty when he said, if I publish this report and I publicize this report, in which I, from the White House, tell America that the white people did this to the black people, it will be completely radioactive. It'll be political suicide. And sure enough, Nixon kind of beat up on the report in the course of him campaigning in 1968. There's a general sense from whites that the Democrats have lost control of American cities, of their own convention in Chicago, and they can't keep you safe. There's increasing crime in the country. The murder rate is increasing, and Nixon simply plays to those fears and those anxieties. And the Kerner report is the last gasp of a particular kind of 60s liberalism. Because what they say, which is something that was not radical or controversial at the time, was simply that government had a role to play in securing the prosperity of American citizens. And that housing, employment, these are all things that government has a role in. When they make their recommendations saying that we need to create 2 million jobs immediately, we need to create 6 million units of affordable housing immediately, we need to set up bureaucracies that deal with, it's a very aggressive idea that government can be part of the solution. And of course, 12 years later, Ronald Reagan is saying government is the problem. And so we have still not really come to terms, even as we look at the haggling now over the infrastructure bill. We have completely rejected the idea, in common parlance, that government has a role to play in securing equality and prosperity for the population. And so that's how the Kerner Commission report becomes an orphan.
Right, right. That's very, very well said. I believe it is time for us to see if anyone in the audience has any questions. If you do, we'll need you to come to the microphone so that those folks on Zoom can hear you. So if anyone has a question and want to make their way to the audience, make their way to the microphone, and want to remind folks that questions usually end with an inflection where statements are declaratory. So we want you all to make sure that you do ask a question, and we'll go ahead and hear from this gentleman. Thank you so much.
How are you doing? In the context of African pessimism, what gives you hope?
Oh, it's funny, I get that question a lot. I have a lot of hope. I have a vast reserve of hope. But what I don't have is cheap hope. Like in America, we look at catastrophe and say, it'll be all right. And you're like, hell no, it won't be all right. The situation we're in now, right now, is dire. American democracy is under threat. But I always say this when people ask me about hope. I say I have the hope of a boxer going into the late rounds. Which is to say, whatever kept you on your feet this long will keep you on your feet to the final bell. And if you can make it to the final bell, you have a chance of winning. And so I think it's a very realistic, pragmatic kind of hope. And it's also rooted in the fact that, in every place that I talk, I wind up bringing this up, that my father had a 3rd grade education. I have a PhD. America did not willingly yield the state of affairs in which my family went from 3rd grade to PhD in one generation. That was black folk and white folk of conscience, people of different backgrounds of conscience that put their shoulder to the wheel of history. And I think that there was less empirical basis for hope for people in that circumstance than there is for people who are in the circumstances that we confront right now.
Thank you. Any other questions from people in the audience? Because if not, I do have another one. As you all are thinking, then I'll go ahead and ask this one. I wanted to ask, What do you think the members of the commission would think about the Defund the Police movement?
Oh, it's so interesting. So we kept finding all of these like Easter eggs in the book. And so there's this section, we were kind of at the end of the book, we were slogging through. Your publisher kept coming back with like these questions that would get on our nerves. We were sick of the whole process. And I was working at this Airbnb late one night, and I was just kind of like going through like line after line, and then I read something that stopped me. And it was this footnote in which they said, people in the ghetto have an inordinate amount of contact with police. Police are summoned to grapple with virtually every concern in the ghetto. What this does is amplify the amount of exposure between ghetto residents and law enforcement, with each interaction having the possibility of something going wrong. And what they proposed was that there be alternate social service institutions that can address the problems in communities that don't require a law enforcement response. That was essentially what the Defund the Police people said a half century later.
Right.
You're saying we use police for everything, and we wind up with situations in which things go sideways. And you need to take money from police and create these other kinds of ways of addressing problems. Or as Akila Sherrills, who's someone who I have a great deal of respect for, he runs a violence intervention organization in Newark, said, the thing that differentiates safe neighborhoods from unsafe neighborhoods is not the number of police. He said, when I go to safe neighborhoods, you don't see police on every corner. So because there's the presence of all these other things.
Right.
And so they recognized that in 1968. In the last year and a half, people weren't able to get past their initial reaction to the slogan, defund the police. But the ideas implicit in it, I mean, the first person who said anything that could be described as defund the police to me was a Newark police officer. He was like, they have us doing all kind of stuff we shouldn't be doing, If I showed up at a city council meeting, if somebody said defund the police, everybody in the right wing would lose their mind. If I showed up at a city council meeting from a consulting firm, charged them a mid six figure fee, and told them that I wanted to create a plan for their law enforcement to focus upon their core competencies, I would walk out with a fat check and a round of applause.
Right.
But it would be essentially the same ideas.
Absolutely, absolutely. Anyone else in the audience have any questions for Professor Cobb?
Feel free to just go right up to the top there. I'm a big fan of
Oh, thank
yours
you.
reading
Thank
the
you. I
New Yorker,
appreciate
so
that.
I'm a little nervous even
Thank you.
addressing you, but I'm assuming writing this is an attempt to get at truth. And truth is under siege right now. And I would love your opinion on the role of the media in covering more and more total absurd lies that have gone on that I've grown up with about, really from Reconstruction time on. Now we're hearing about in Texas that teachers are being told they have to tell the other side of slavery. And is there a point where it gets to such an absurd level, but it's still so frustrating that we hear all these lies covered all the time, that these extremists on the on the conservative side get so much media attention. And I would just love to hear your thoughts about what can be done to have a louder voice on the progressive side. Thank you.
I think that's an important question that I tackle in my next book. It literally is true. I'm literally working on a book that talks about democracy. And one of the things I think is a problem, and it ties back to Kerner, actually, because the Kerner Commission report in addition to the things that they talked about with government, they also criticized media. And they said that the media, the way that the media covered these situations tended to inflame the tensions. And one of the reasons they did this was that the media was monochromatically white, at the time. And they needed to diversify the media. They needed to have different approaches to coverage and all these things. And so it was really a kind of in-depth analysis of this. But institutionally, because I work in media, at the New Yorker and have worked at other outlets prior to the New Yorker, and because I teach at a journalism school, I've had a lot of conversations about this. And one of the problems with the media is that it is not sufficiently different from any other powerful institution in the United States. Populated by people who went to the same schools, who generally come from the same class background, generally of the same race, generally of the same gender, disproportionately so, and generally of the same defaults. So, default attitudes. And so I had a conversation with a very highly placed editor at a very powerful publication. It's not hard to figure it out. But this was early on in the Trump era. And so I said to him, you're someone for whom the institutions in this country have generally worked out. For generations, those institutions have generally worked out. For me, going back to my father, I said, I am looking at my father had a third grade education. I am looking at the rise of people who would be happy to reduce the next generation of my family to third grade education. I view them as an existential threat. And people who have not understood the fallibility of American institutions are uniquely unsuited to recognize when those institutions are threatened. And so American democracy, which is, if I can just be permitted one quick tangent, the most absurd thing about January 6th was the belief that this was a rigged election, despite all of the evidence, all of the examinations, all of the things that had gone, reported by institutions, the media, which is generally speaking habitually frightened to be thought of as biased. And so they go the extra mile to make even things that are not even, to equalize things that are not equal, and to say that they are allergic to the idea that one party in the United States has slid in a direction of fascism, which is something that political scientists have pointed out for years, but they are so easily wounded by criticisms and allegations of bias that generally speaking, institutions can't go there. But for me, I said, if you want to look at a rigged election in this country, it's not January 20th, but you don't have to go that far. You just look at literally every single election in this country before 1965. When black people couldn't vote, like 14% of the population, overwhelmingly located in the South, would have got murdered if you showed up at the polling places. We don't know what Congress was supposed to look like. We don't know who was supposed to win what presidential election. We don't know what legislation would have gotten passed if those people had actually been represented in Congress. We don't know any of that prior to 1965. And then we only have to go back 45 years, and the majority of the American population is disenfranchised because women can't vote either. But yet we declare ourselves to be the benchmark democracy. And this very sheltered, privileged view of democracy is the reason that we're in the trouble we're in now. Because they believe democracy is strong, and people who are in these other positions understand just how weak and just how new it is. That we've only been doing this for about a half century. I'm sorry for that speech, but I think that that's like the urgent issue that I think is before us.
And the topic of your next book.
And the topic of my next book.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yes, we have time for one more question.
Okay, Gina.
I have so many topics we could be here all night. But, the dumbing down of America, lots of things. But what can we do better to keep the flame warm?
Mm-hmm.
You know, there was the Arab Spring, we definitely had a Black Spring last year.
Mm-hmm.
And it just seems like now our eyes are in another direction, and we know that those same things are continuing to happen. I feel like we've become numb.
Mm-hmm.
What can we do to keep the flame hot?
Mm-hmm. I think, the person who I listen to about this is Reverend William Barber. And he's a tremendously inspirational figure to me because he simply does the work. Mm-hmm. Simply does the work. What I've learned from my examination of these movements in the 20th century, in the 19th century, is that there are always these kind of ebbs and flows. And the real work is in keeping it in people's minds and doing the kind of organizing and the fallow periods, the points where it seems like things are going to change, but they don't. About how long abolitionists fought to push the country to the brink of a place where they had no choice but to grapple with slavery, or the protracted struggle that was required to get the 8-hour workday, or to get rid of child labor, or to get the right to vote for women, to get the right to vote for predominantly white women, and then half a century later for Black women. Like, all of those things required that people do this when it seemed like they had no momentum. And it seemed like people had forgotten. But when you look at the kind of long span of things, you recognize that it was culminations of those things. In the same way that these uprisings that they talked about in Kerner were the culmination of things that had taken decades, of problems just accruing and accruing until there's this flashover moment. And I think that that's what we have to do. Like, we have to study, we have to talk to our neighbor, we have to push people to vote. I took my daughter to vote with me last night, it was the night before last. I took her to vote with me, and then we went into the booth. I let her put the ballot into the machine, and we came out, and I immediately gave her some candy. And I was like, part of parenting is manipulation. And I was like, so we're going to have, like, in your little 4-year-old brain, you associate positive stimulation with voting.
There you go.
So 30 years from now, when there's some election where democracy is on the line or something, I don't have to worry about anybody named Cobb who's like, oh, I'm not going to vote, whatever. It was like, yes, we are trying to make this happen now, in great ways and in small ways.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So we're done?
I think we're done.
All right.
Thank you. Oh, can I just add one thing? These are great holiday gifts. I also have the other book, The Matter of Black Lives. If you've been watching any of the coverage of the supply chain, where people are saying that all those things that you want to order as gifts may not show up, but they have books here today. So you can actually do your Christmas shopping, your holiday shopping, or whatever. You can get that knocked out right now. So, I'm just saying.
That's right. Thank you, Jelani, and thank you, Arva, both of you. That was great, and this is a conversation that I hope we all continue.